King Tando ruled the vast Kalimba Kingdom, a land of fertile farms, proud warriors, and thriving marketplaces where his word carried the weight of law. His power was unquestioned, and his authority stretched across every corner of the kingdom. But as the seasons passed and the king grew older, one truth began to trouble his heart. Every ruler must one day leave the throne. When that moment drew near, King Tando refused to accept it. What followed was not glory, but a chain of events that brought great suffering to the people of Kalimba Kingdom. Welcome to a land where stories carry the wisdom of generations, passed from voice to voice beneath village skies and evening fires. Today's story tells of King Tando of Kalimba Kingdom, a ruler whose fear of death led him down a path that changed the fate of his people. Listen closely, for stories like this have long been told to remind us that every choice a leader makes can shape the destiny of a kingdom. If you enjoy meaningful African folktales, remember to subscribe for more stories filled with wisdom and lessons from the past. The Kalimba Kingdom was a land blessed with rich soil and hard-working people. Wide farmlands stretched beyond the village paths, where farmers rose with the first light of the sun to tend their crops. Markets filled with traders who traveled from distant places, bringing baskets of grain, carved tools, woven cloth, and stories from other lands. The sounds of bargaining voices, laughter, and village drums often carried through the air as people gathered to exchange goods and news. Life in Kalimba moved with a steady rhythm. Hunters returned from the forests with game, fishermen brought their catch from the rivers, and elders gathered beneath large trees to discuss matters that concerned the community. Children played along dusty paths while learning the traditions and wisdom passed down through generations. The kingdom was strong, orderly, and full of life. At the center of this thriving land stood the ruler, whose name was spoken with both respect and caution, King Tando. King Tando had ruled Kalimba for many years. He was known as a leader of great authority, a man whose decisions shaped the direction of the kingdom. His palace stood tall above the surrounding homes, a symbol of the power he held. Warriors guarded the gates, ready to defend the land from any threat. Under his command, the kingdom remained stable and secure. Disputes were settled by his judgment, and neighboring lands recognized the strength of his rule. Messengers who traveled beyond Kalimba carried word of his leadership, and many spoke of him as a ruler who maintained firm control over his domain. But time moves forward for every ruler, no matter how powerful they may be. As the seasons continued to change and the years slowly passed, King Tando began to notice signs that troubled his thoughts. His once powerful body no longer moved with the same strength it once had. The long years of leadership had begun to show their mark. With each passing season, a single thought returned to his mind again and again. One day, another ruler would sit upon his throne. The idea unsettled him deeply. The throne had been his seat of power for so long that he could not imagine a day when it would belong to someone else. The crown he wore had come to define his place in the world. The elders often spoke about the natural order of life, reminding people that leadership passes from one generation to the next. But King Tando found no comfort in those words. Instead, a quiet fear began to take root within his heart, the fear that his time as ruler might one day come to an end. As the troubling thought continued to weigh heavily on his mind, King Tando decided that he could no longer ignore it. The question that had been growing within him demanded an answer, and he believed that somewhere within his kingdom someone must hold the knowledge he sought. One morning, the royal messengers moved swiftly through Kalimba Kingdom, carrying the king's command. The elders, the wise men, and the most respected voices of the land were summoned to the palace. These were men who had spent many years studying the customs of the people, observing the patterns of nature, and guiding the community with the knowledge passed down through generations. By midday, they gathered in the great courtyard of the palace. The atmosphere was serious, for when a king called such a meeting, it was never without reason. When King Tando entered, the crowd grew silent. The elders bowed their heads respectfully as the ruler took his place. For a moment, the king said nothing. His eyes moved slowly across the gathered faces before he finally spoke. He asked them a question that none of them had expected. The king wanted to know how a ruler could continue living and ruling forever. A quiet murmur spread among the elders. They looked at one another with concern, for the question carried a weight that no wise person could ignore. At last, the eldest among them stepped forward. With careful words, he spoke about the order that governs all living things. He explained that every leader, no matter how powerful, eventually passes his responsibilities to the next generation. This was the way communities survived and remained balanced. Other elders supported his words. They spoke about the wisdom of accepting the path that life follows. They reminded the king that many great rulers before him had once held power, yet their time eventually came to an end. But King Tando was not satisfied with their answers. The thought of surrendering his throne filled him with deep resistance. To him, the idea of leaving power behind felt like losing everything he had built during his years of rule. The king dismissed the elders with visible disappointment. Their wisdom, which had guided the kingdom for generations, did nothing to calm the fear that had taken hold of his heart. Days passed, but the king's mind remained restless. Then, not long afterward, an unusual visitor arrived at the gates of the palace. The traveler had journeyed from far beyond the borders of Kalimba Kingdom. Word quickly reached the royal court that this stranger claimed to possess rare knowledge about powerful rituals practiced in distant lands. When the traveler was brought before King Tando, he spoke carefully and with confidence. He claimed that certain rituals, if performed correctly, could extend a person's life far beyond its ordinary limit. The moment the king heard these words, his interest grew. For the first time since the elders had left the palace, King Tando believed he might finally have found the answer he had been searching for. And with that moment, a path began to form, one that would soon change the fate of Kalimba Kingdom in ways no one had expected. The traveler spoke with calm confidence as he stood before King Tando. He told the king that in distant lands there were rituals believed to extend a ruler's life far beyond its natural limit. According to the traveler, such rituals were not simple acts. They required strict obedience, careful preparation, and sacrifices meant to strengthen the power of the ceremony. The traveler explained that the ritual had to be performed over several nights and under conditions that could not be broken. Certain offerings had to be gathered. Certain actions had to be carried out exactly as instructed. If even one step was ignored, the ritual would fail. To a man who feared losing his throne, the promise of longer life sounded like an answer he had been searching for. King Tando listened carefully to every word. Soon after, the elders of Kalimba Kingdom learned about the traveler's claims. Concerns spread among them, and they requested another meeting with the king. When they gathered again before him, they spoke with urgency. They reminded him that many communities across the continent had long warned against attempts to control the natural order of life. Elders, in many African traditions, have often taught that life and leadership move in cycles, and that balance within a kingdom depends on respecting those cycles. With deep respect, they urged the king to reconsider, but the fear within King Tando had already grown too strong. The possibility of escaping death had captured his thoughts completely. He could no longer imagine turning away from something that promised to keep him on the throne. Ignoring the warnings, the king gave his command. Preparations for the ritual began within the palace grounds. At first, the people of Kalimba Kingdom knew very little about what was taking place. The palace guards moved quietly as they gathered the items the traveler had requested. Fires burned late into the night in places where few were usually allowed to enter. Messengers carried instructions across the kingdom as the ritual slowly unfolded. But it did not take long before the people began to notice changes around them. In some farming areas, crops that had once grown strong began to weaken. Plants that normally thrived in the fertile soil of Kalimba no longer produced the same harvest. Farmers who had worked the land for many years could not explain why the fields had suddenly become less reliable. Along the rivers, fishermen also noticed unusual changes. Water levels that usually remained steady began to drop. Certain fishing spots that had fed families for generations became difficult to use. Hunters spoke about strange patterns among the animals of the forests. Creatures that once followed familiar paths now moved in unpredictable ways. As these changes spread, quiet conversations began among the people. In the marketplaces, traders lowered their voices as they spoke to one another. Farmers exchanged worried looks while discussing their fields. Many wondered whether the unusual events had something to do with the secret activities happening within the palace. Some of the elders continued to approach King Tando, hoping he would listen before the situation grew worse. They warned him again that disturbing the balance of life often brings consequences that affect more than one person. They reminded him that the well-being of a kingdom depends on harmony between leadership, nature, and the people. But each time they spoke, the king refused to change his decision. To him, stopping the ritual would mean surrendering the chance to escape the fate he feared most. And so, despite the growing signs around him and the repeated warnings of the elders, King Tando ordered the ritual to continue. With each passing day, the tension within Kalimba Kingdom grew stronger, and the quiet whispers among the people slowly spread throughout the land. After many nights of preparation and strict observance of the traveler's instructions, the ritual finally reached its final stage. Fires burned through the darkness, and those who had taken part in the ceremony waited in silence for the moment the traveler had promised. When the final act of the ritual was completed, the traveler stepped back and declared that the work had been done. According to his claim, the forces that once threatened the life of King Tando had now been pushed away. The king, he said, would continue to live and rule far beyond the time that nature had intended. When King Tando heard these words, relief filled his heart. The fear that had troubled him for so long seemed to disappear at last. He believed that the throne of Kalimba Kingdom would remain his for many more years, perhaps longer than any ruler before him. But outside the palace walls, the kingdom was beginning to face a very different reality. Not long after the ritual ended, the changes that had already begun across the land grew far worse. The rains that once arrived in their season became weak and uncertain. The fertile soil that farmers depended upon began to dry and crack under the heat of the sun. Crops that had once filled the markets now struggled to grow. Soon, drought spread across many parts of Kalimba Kingdom. Farmers who had always trusted the land to provide for their families now faced empty fields. Wells that once held enough water for entire communities began to shrink. The rivers that flowed through the kingdom grew shallow, forcing fishermen to travel farther just to make a small catch. As the weeks passed, the struggle reached nearly every corner of the kingdom. Families found it harder to gather enough food. Market stalls that had once overflowed with harvests now displayed only a few baskets of grain. Concern and uncertainty began to replace the confidence the people once felt about the future. In villages across the kingdom, people began asking the same troubling question: why was this happening? The elders watched these changes with growing concern. They had seen many seasons and understood that when the balance of life is disturbed, the effects can spread far beyond what anyone expects. At last, they gathered once more to discuss what they believed was happening to their land. After careful reflection, the elders came to a painful conclusion. They believed that the ritual performed for King Tando had disrupted the natural balance that governs life itself. In many African traditions, elders have long taught that life moves in cycles, and that when those cycles are forced or resisted, harmony within the land can be broken. The elders realized that as long as King Tando refused the natural path that every ruler must eventually follow, the suffering of the kingdom might continue. With heavy hearts, they brought this message to the palace. When they spoke, their words carried both wisdom and deep concern. They explained that leadership is meant to guide a community through its seasons of change. When a ruler tries to hold on to power beyond its rightful time, the balance between people, land, and life itself may be disturbed. Meanwhile, the people of Kalimba Kingdom had begun to lose hope. In the marketplaces and gathering places of the villages, quiet conversations turned into open worry. Many remembered the warnings the elders had given before the ritual began. Now, as the drought continued and food became harder to find, some people began to wonder whether the choices of their ruler had brought these hardships upon them. For the first time in many years, doubt began to grow among the people of Kalimba Kingdom. And at the center of it all stood King Tando, a ruler who believed he had conquered death, while the kingdom around him slowly struggled to survive. As the days passed, King Tando could no longer ignore the suffering that had spread throughout Kalimba Kingdom. He watched as families struggled to gather food, as farmers worked tirelessly on parched fields, and as children went thirsty while the rivers ran low. The laughter that had once filled the marketplaces had faded, replaced by worry and quiet murmurs of fear. For the first time, the weight of his decisions pressed heavily on his heart. The ritual that had promised him life now seemed to have brought hardship instead. The power he had once cherished now felt like a burden, for he could see clearly that his fear of death had led the kingdom into crisis. The elders approached the king once more, their faces grave but full of compassion. They spoke slowly, reminding him that the strength of a kingdom depends not on a single ruler, but on the harmony between the people, the land, and the natural order of life. They told King Tando that the kingdom could only heal if he released his hold on life and allowed the natural course to take its place. They reminded him that wisdom often lies in acceptance, and that true leadership sometimes requires letting go. The king spent long hours alone, reflecting on the lives of those he had been entrusted to protect. He remembered the markets, the rivers, the farms, and the faces of his people. Slowly, understanding began to grow within him. At last, King Tando made a final decision. With a heavy but resolute heart, he ended the ritual. He accepted the natural order of life, acknowledging that every ruler must one day leave the throne, and that trying to defy this truth had caused pain for those he loved. As he stepped back from the power he had clung to so desperately, the land of Kalimba Kingdom began to recover. The rains returned to the fields, crops grew stronger, rivers filled once more, and the people slowly regained their hope. Life returned to its rhythm, and the kingdom healed under the guidance of its leaders and the wisdom of the elders. In releasing his fear, King Tando had not only saved his people, but had learned the greatest lesson of all, that true strength lies in understanding one's place within the balance of life. And so, the elders of Kalimba Kingdom teach that no ruler, no matter how powerful, can escape the path of life. When leadership is guided by fear rather than wisdom, even the strongest kingdom may face suffering. Every story carries lessons for those who listen closely, reminding us that true strength comes from understanding, humility, and respect for the natural order.